One of the Primarchs figured out what the Emperor was really doing, and they said nothing. Across 65 novels, the Horus Heresy buries its most dangerous revelations in subtext. A line of dialogue here, a refusal to commit there. A private conversation on a dead world where one of the Emperor's gene sons compares the Imperium's founding ideology to slave owner propaganda, and then goes on fighting for the slaveholders anyway. The trail is scattered across at least 4 Chris Wraight novels and a handful of short stories, hidden in behavioral patterns and philosophical asides rather than laid out in a single dramatic confession. But it points, with accumulating force, to the Primarch of the 5th Legion, Jagatai Khan. The Warhawk of Chogoris. The deception wasn't one lie, it was a series of them, nested inside each other, each one protecting the next. The outermost layer was doctrine. The Imperial Truth, the official ideology of the Great Crusade, demanded atheism, rationalism, materialism. Every world brought into compliance received the same message. There are no gods, no spirits, no supernatural forces. Only science, only the species' potential. The Emperor embedded this creed into the military structure of his legions. At the Council of Nikaea in 001 M31, held in an ancient amphitheater on the world of Nikaea that seated tens of thousands, the Emperor delivered his decree absolute, banning Legion Librarius use. He ordered everyone else to act as though it didn't exist. Beneath the doctrine sat a deeper suppression. The warp wasn't empty or mindless. It housed sentient powers, the entities later known as the Chaos Gods, and the Emperor had interacted with them directly. In The First Heretic, Aaron Dembski-Bowden gives the word-bearer's perspective on the Emperor's origins, that he had made some form of bargain with the Chaos Gods, taken their gifts, folded them into his gene craft to create the Primarchs, and then refused to honor the debt. Whether this account is literally accurate or colored by its chaos-aligned narrator, the core implication threads through multiple novels. The Emperor knew the warp was inhabited by malevolent intelligences and chose to build an empire-wide ideology denying their existence. The Imperial Truth wasn't innocent ignorance. It was a calculated blindfold, designed to starve those entities of the attention and belief that fed them, at the cost of leaving the Emperor's own soldiers defenseless against threats they'd been told weren't real. Deeper still was the Webway Project. After the triumph of Ulanor, the Emperor withdrew from the Great Crusade, retreated beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, and told nobody what he was building. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's Master of Mankind establishes the scope. The Emperor was constructing a human-accessible extension into the Eldari Webway, a network of tunnels through a dimension adjacent to the warp that would allow instantaneous travel between worlds without ever touching the Imperium. If it succeeded, mankind would no longer need navigators to steer through demon-haunted currents. The War Master wasn't told. The Primarchs weren't told. Even after the heresy began tearing the Imperium apart, the Emperor sat on the Golden Throne, bleeding psychic energy into the breach Magnus had torn in the Webway's wards, fighting a war his own generals didn't know existed. And beneath all of that was the question of the Primarchs themselves. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's oldest and most trusted advisor, a perpetual who had been at his side since the Unification Wars, told the Primarchs he'd suggested making them sisters. The Emperor thought he was joking. Malcador wasn't. Whether that exchange was genuine policy disagreement or grim humor, it reveals the register in which the Emperor and his closest collaborator discussed these transhuman demigods as design variables. Configuration options in a military engineering project. The Thunder Warriors, the superhuman soldiers who'd conquered Terra before the Space Marines existed, had been disposed of once their purpose was served. The Primarchs had reason to wonder if they were next. So, an enforced atheism, denying real gods, a suppressed metaphysical reality, a hidden strategic endgame, and a paternal relationship that may have been closer to asset management than fatherhood. Most of the Emperor's sons never saw the full picture. A few pulled at individual threads, and the threads pulled back. Lorgar, Primarch of the word-bearers, demanded metaphysical truth with a zealot's hunger. All I ever wanted was the truth, opens his manifesto, the Book of Lorgar. Remember those words as you read the ones that follow. He wrote the Lectitio Divinitatis, proclaiming the Emperor divine, and spent decades building cathedrals on conquered worlds instead of subjugating them efficiently. The Emperor's response was Monarchia, the word-bearer's perfect city, reduced to rubble while Lorgar and his entire legion were forced to their knees in the ashes by the Emperor's psychic will. Shattered, Lorgar went looking for gods who would accept his devotion. He found them, and they welcomed him. Faith made him one of the earliest Primarchs to fall. Magnus the Red possessed arguably the deepest raw knowledge of the warp among all the Primarchs. At Nikaea, Magnus argued passionately that psychic power was a tool, not an inherent evil, that knowledge itself wasn't tainted, and that the danger lay in becoming its pawn. Magnus obeyed publicly and continued his research in private on Prospero. When he learned of Horus's corruption, he used sorcery to send a psychic warning directly to the Emperor on Terra, and in doing so, he shattered the wards protecting the webway extension beneath the Imperial Palace. Magnus knew more than anyone about the warp's hidden reality. He acted on that knowledge. He broke the one thing his father was secretly trying to build. Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, perceived hypocrisy. He saw the gap between the Imperium's civilizing rhetoric and the massacre-level violence required to enforce it. His accusations targeted moral inconsistency, the Emperor preaching enlightenment while deploying legions that burned cities and broke civilizations whole. Kurz identified the contradiction in the Emperor's behavior. He didn't map the strategic architecture underneath it. Sanguinius, the great angel, had prophetic foresight, visions of futures that might come to pass. He was considered by many, even by Horus himself, the noblest of the Primarchs. But the strongest lore accounts place his most consequential visions after the heresy was already underway, after Horus had turned and the galaxy was burning. Foreseeing your own death aboard the vengeful spirit isn't the same as ideological skepticism about the Emperor's doctrine before a single bolt round was fired. Sanguinius glimpsed outcomes. He didn't diagnose the machinery producing them. Alfarius remains the perpetual wild card. His Primarch novel famously opens by undermining every fact it establishes, and proceeds to do exactly that. The twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion clearly possessed unusual intelligence access and operated with strategic autonomy that unsettled their brothers. But secrecy isn't insight. Autonomy isn't comprehension. The available text gives Khan a stronger evidentiary foundation for the specific claim at the center of this argument. Jagatai Khan fits the thesis better than any of his brothers, and the reason predates the Imperium by decades. He grew up on Chogoris, officially designated Mundus Planus, a feral world where the steppe nomads lived by horse, blade, and a tradition of shamanic practice that treated the warp as a dangerous but navigable reality. The young Jagatai was found by a nomadic tribe, rose to command it, and then unified every warring clan on the planet's vast plains against their city-dwelling oppressors, the Palatine Empire. By the time the Great Crusade reached Chogoris, Jagatai had already conquered a world and built a civilization from its fragments. He knelt when the Emperor arrived, but he knelt as a sovereign, recognizing an ally with a larger vision, not as a lost child overwhelmed by a father's presence. The Emperor offered galactic scale. Jagatai judged the partnership worth accepting. Partnership, not surrender. Once reunited with the Imperium, that independence didn't soften. Chris Wraight's Warhawk of Chogoris depicts Jagatai in his early days on Terra, growing increasingly frustrated, clashing frequently with his father over the direction and governance of the Crusade. He wasn't a Primarch who fell gratefully into line. The Emperor's court was a place of hierarchy, ritual, and ideological uniformity. Jagatai had spent his formative years conquering a world where the strong survived by staying light, staying mobile, and trusting their own senses over anyone's pronouncements. Terra felt like a cage with gilded bars. Games Workshop's own official description of the character carries this tension forward. Jagatai Khan was fiercely proud and something of an outsider among his brothers, though as much by his own choice as the neglect of his kin. The White Scars were deployed as pathfinders and forward scouts throughout the Great Crusade, operating alone at the fringes, far from court politics and the interlocking alliances that other legions built. They were the Imperium's eyes in the dark, and they were treated as expendable advance elements, rarely honored and easily forgotten. Few battle honors from the Unification Wars record the Fifth Legion's sacrifices. The warriors who would become the White Scars took a quiet pride in their invisible role, while growing more isolated from their brother legions by the decade. Jagatai didn't fight this arrangement. He preferred the distance, and the distance gave him room to observe without being observed. The critical piece of what Jagatai brought with him from Chogoris was epistemic, not just cultural. His homeworld's steppe traditions included the Storm Seers, psychic practitioners whose disciplines predated the Emperor's arrival by centuries. These weren't rogue psychers or sorcerers dabbling in forbidden arts. They were an integrated part of Chogorian society, respected and disciplined, channeling the power of the warp through training and tradition rather than suppressing it. Secondary analysis of Warhawk of Chogoris identifies the central conflict of the book as exactly this tension. Jagatai was aware of the dangers of the warp and psychers, and the Imperial Truth sat ill with him. He'd grown up in a culture that handled psychic reality through discipline. The Emperor's answer was denial. That gap was unbridgeable. At Nikaea, Jagatai positioned himself alongside Magnus in supporting the continued use of psychers within the legions. Not because he shared Magnus's obsessive appetite for arcane knowledge. Jagatai was a pragmatist, not an occultist, but because the Emperor's proposed solution struck him as fundamentally dishonest. You don't make a dangerous thing safe by declaring it doesn't exist. You make it safe by training your people to handle it. The Emperor's ruling went the other direction entirely. Suppress, deny, punish. Jagatai watched the most powerful psyker in human history order everyone else to stop using psychic power, and the dissonance cut deep. He'd met this type of authority before. He'd overthrown it on Chogoris. The novels make the dissonance explicit. Chris Wraight, who wrote Jagatai Khan, Warhawk of Chogoris, Scars, The Path of Heaven, and the Siege of Terra novel, Warhawk, essentially the definitive authorial voice for the White Scars across the entire heresy, built the Khan as a Primarch whose skepticism wasn't reactive, it was structural. In Warhawk of Chogoris, Wright frames the defense of imperial secrecy in openly paternalistic terms. Jagatai answers by comparing that logic to the old empires of Chogoris, postponing freedom for the people they ruled, and by warning that once the blindfold slips, the fury of the deceived will be limitless. He isn't guessing. He's identifying a specific political pattern, the indefinite deferral of truth by those who benefit from its suppression, and mapping it directly onto the Emperor's governance of the Imperium. The word he uses is blindfold. He predicts, with precise accuracy, that the concealment will fail and that the rage of the deceived will be limitless. The Horus Heresy is, among many things, exactly the catastrophe he described. Lorgar's fury at Monarchia, Magnus's desperate warning that shattered the webway wards, Horus's own corruption, fed by the discovery that his father had hidden the truth about the warp's gods from the sons he'd sent to fight in their shadow. Jagatai articulated the mechanism that would break the Imperium years before it broke. In the same novel, Wright presents Khan as seeing his father in equally stark terms. The Emperor's word becomes treated as truth, and if reality fails to match it, power is used until it does. Jagatai is describing a mechanism, not expressing loyalty. He's laying out how the Emperor constructs consensus, not through persuasion, not through evidence, but through the raw exercise of power to reshape reality until the official version becomes the only surviving version. The Imperial Truth doesn't need to be true. It needs to be enforced until no alternative remains. Jagatai sees the process, names it, and continues serving the man whose methods he has just dissected. He also carried secrets most of his brothers lacked. In The Last Council, a Horus Heresy short story, Jagatai reveals that Horus, before his corruption, discovered Malkador the Sigillite's hidden former identity and shared it with the Khan. Jagatai possessed this knowledge for years. He knew the Emperor's most trusted advisor was operating under a concealed identity. He didn't confront Malkador publicly. He didn't use it as leverage. He held it, the way a man holds a weapon he hasn't decided to draw. The behavioral pattern intensifies during the heresy itself. Shortly after the triumph of Ulanor, Jagatai and the White Scars were dispatched to the Chondak system, a trinary star system infested with remnant orc forces from the Ulanor Empire. The campaign lasted years, a grinding xenocidal slog that required the White Scars to hunt greenskins across the system's worlds. It was the kind of assignment that kept a legion occupied, and crucially, beyond reliable astropathic range of Terra. When messages from Rogel Dorn finally reached the Khan, warning that Horus and 8 other Primarchs had turned traitor, the White Scars simultaneously found their exit blockaded by an Alpha Legion fleet. Contradictory orders arrived from both Terra and the War Master's camp. The Alpha Legion's behavior only deepened the confusion. Khan refused to commit based on propaganda from either side. Skeptics could argue that Khan's hesitation was simply a product of information scarcity, not pre-existing insight. The White Scars were isolated. Their astropathic channels were compromised. They couldn't verify who had betrayed whom. That reading holds for the Chondak situation in isolation. But it doesn't account for the years of prior philosophical groundwork, the blindfold metaphor, the dissection of imperial consensus construction, the secret knowledge about Malkador's hidden identity, the Nikaea stance that recognized the Emperor's denial of psychic reality as a political choice rather than honest science. Khan didn't arrive at doubt during the Chondak's blackout. He arrived at Chondak's already doubting. The information vacuum confirmed what he'd long suspected without forcing him into a premature declaration. When the White Scars broke through, Khan executing a fleet maneuver called the Chisel that punched a wedge through the Alpha Legion formation and allowed his ships to reach the warp. He didn't run straight to Terra as Dorn had ordered. He went to Prospero, the burned homeworld of the Thousand Suns, the planet the Emperor had ordered destroyed. He needed to see the ruin for himself before he would trust anyone's version of what had happened. On that devastated world, where the once great pyramids of Tizca lay shattered, and the psychic residue of an entire legion's destruction still hung in the thin air, a shard of Magnus appeared. Whatever remained of the Crimson King after the destruction of Prospero materialized before Jagatai, and the exchange between them wasn't hostile. "Put your sword down," Magnus told him. "You couldn't hurt me with it, and I have no intention of hurting you." Khan engaged directly with the brother most entangled in the Emperor's forbidden truths, a figure the Imperium had condemned, whose legion had been shattered for the crime of knowing too much. He didn't flinch from a condemned Primarch's shade. He listened. He assessed. 2 brothers who had both supported Psykers at Nikaea, standing in the ashes of what the Emperor's decree absolute had ultimately produced. And then he made his choice, not based on obedience and not based on doctrine, but on his own assessment of the galaxy's wreckage. When the traitors offered him a place in their ranks, Khan rejected the offer. His reasoning, as framed across accounts of this period, cut in 2 directions simultaneously. He viewed the Emperor as a tyrant, but Horus as something worse, a slave to the warp. 2 conclusions, held at once. The first acknowledges imperial deception as settled judgment, not speculation. The second recognizes that the corruption of chaos represents a more terminal ruin than tyranny. Khan saw through the Emperor. He saw through Horus. He weighed both evils and chose the one that at least pointed toward human survival. The contrast with Mortarion sharpens the point. Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard, had been one of the fiercest voices against psychers and warp-born power, shaped by a childhood on Barbarous under the tyranny of Xeno's sorcerers. He hated everything the warp represented. And yet, by the late heresy, the Death Guard had fallen to Nurgle. Mortarion became exactly what he'd spent his entire life opposing, a servant of the warp, wielding the corruption he'd sworn to eradicate. In the Path of Heaven, Wraight places Khan and Mortarion in direct opposition, and the contrast is devastating. Mortarion's anti-psyker conviction curdled into the very thing it claimed to fight. Khan's pragmatic acceptance of psychic reality, his insistence on discipline over denial, kept him and his legion intact. Wraight crystallized Khan's position in the Path of Heaven with a brutal admission. He was fighting for a father he never loved against a brother he did, defending an empire that never wanted him against an army that would have taken him in a heartbeat. Every word in that passage is a wound. Jagatai fights for Terra while naming exactly what Terra cost him. The Emperor was never a father. The Imperium never valued the White Scars. Horus, the brother he'd actually respected, the one Primarch who had recognized and praised the pioneer companies of the 5th Legion during the early Crusade when no one else bothered, would have welcomed him without hesitation. Every reason to defect was present. The Khan chose loyalty anyway, because loyalty to a liar, building something that might preserve the species, struck him as less catastrophic than loyalty to a slave whose masters wanted to consume it. The honest boundary of the argument sits here. The behavioral evidence is dense. Jagatai distrusted the Imperial Truth from his first contact with it. He recognized the Emperor's reality-shaping methodology and articulated it in precise terms. He carried secret knowledge about Malkador's hidden identity. He supported psychic practices the Emperor publicly condemned. He refused to commit to either faction without personal verification. The accumulated weight of this material, spread across Warhawk of Chogoris, Scars, the Path of Heaven, the Last Council, and Warhawk, builds a compelling portrait of a Primarch who understood the deception at a structural level. No surviving passage contains a scene where Jagatai explicitly states knowledge of the Webway project or the full scope of the Emperor's dealings with the Chaos Gods before the war began. The evidence is a mosaic: suspicion, pattern recognition, philosophical clarity, operational caution. Not a single confession. That absence is consistent with the thesis rather than fatal to it, but it keeps the conclusion in the realm of strong interpretation, not settled canon. Every Primarch who openly confronted the Emperor's design was destroyed by the confrontation. Lorgar had Monarchia burned to ash while his sons knelt in the rubble. Magnus shattered the Webway trying to deliver a warning no one had asked for. Kurz descended into nihilistic murder, using his visions of the future as proof that justice was impossible. A Primarch who announced, "I know my father is lying about everything," would have been dealt with, censured at minimum, destroyed at worst. Jagatai's survival, his legion's integrity, his arrival at Terra during the siege, with a force still capable of executing the stratagem that reclaimed the Lionsgate spaceport, all of that depended on the fact that he never said the quiet part in a room where it could be used against him. He compared the Imperial Truth to slave empire propaganda in private. He told Malkador he knew the Sigillites' hidden past behind closed doors. He weighed both sides of a galactic civil war with the cold eye of a man who'd already concluded that everyone giving orders was lying, and picked the liars whose lies at least preserved the possibility of a human future. Every other brother who sensed the deception shattered against it. Lorgar through faith, Magnus through knowledge, Kurz through justice, Mortarion through hatred of the warp that delivered him directly into its arms. Sanguinius saw the future and walked into his own death aboard the vengeful spirit. Alfarius burrowed so deep into layers of counter-deception that the lore itself can't determine what he believed. Jagatai confronted it through experience. He'd conquered a world where empires withheld truth from those they ruled. He'd watched the Palatine cities fall to warriors who'd been promised freedom when they were ready for generations until they decided to take it themselves. The Imperial Truth was a map drawn by someone with a vested interest in what the terrain looked like. The warp was the terrain. Jagatai trusted his own eyes over his father's cartography. After the heresy, after the siege, after the emperor was interred on the Golden Throne, Jagatai Khan led the White Scars through the Great Scouring, the massive imperial counteroffensive that drove the traitor legions toward the Eye of Terror. And then, in 084.M31, pursuing Drukhari raiders into the Maelstrom, he followed them through a webway portal. He disappeared. 10,000 years later, no confirmed sighting, no body, no confirmed death. The son who never loved his father, the defender of an empire that never wanted him. The Primarch who identified the emperor's blindfold and predicted the fury that would follow when it slipped. He rode into the one structure the emperor had been secretly building beneath the imperial palace all along, the webway, and he didn't come back. Was the silence wisdom or complicity? Both answers have textual support, and neither is complete without the other. The wisdom case is operational. Khan's restraint preserved a fighting force. The White Scars arrived at Terra during the siege, still capable of prosecuting a campaign that mattered. The reclamation of the Lion's Gate spaceport severed the War Master's supply arteries at a moment when the walls were failing. If Jagatai had challenged the Emperor years earlier, the likely outcome was another Nikaea, forced compliance, disbandment of the Stormseers, possible censure, or worse. A pre-heresy confrontation risked turning the Fifth Legion into another cautionary tale, another set of warriors broken for knowing too much. Khan kept his legion intact by keeping his mouth shut. The complicity case is harder to dismiss. Lorgar went to Monarchia alone. Magnus sent his disastrous warning to Terra alone. Horus walked onto Davin carrying doubts and resentments that no brother had helped him process in safer terms. If the Primarch who understood the Emperor's methods most clearly had ever said to another brother, not publicly, not dramatically, just quietly, one warrior to another, "I see it too, and here is how you carry that knowledge without it consuming you," the calculus of the heresy might have shifted. Khan didn't cause the war. Nothing in the text suggests that. But his silence meant that each brother who cracked under the weight of imperial deception cracked alone, without the one sibling who might have offered a framework for surviving the truth. The case rests on pattern, not confession. On Chris Wraight's accumulated body of work across 5 texts spanning the entire heresy. On the quiet, relentless accumulation of a Primarch who watched his brothers destroy themselves against the same wall he'd decided to walk around. Jagatai Khan saw the Emperor's lie for what it was. He weighed the cost of exposing it, and he concluded that a galaxy held together by deception was preferable to one torn apart by truth delivered at the wrong moment, to the wrong audience, in the wrong way. Whether that makes him the wisest of the Emperor's sons or the most quietly complicit is the question the lore leaves open. The evidence points in both directions. The judgment belongs to you. Subscribe for more deep lore.